there is a global cotton shortage, and Japan is making cotton. There is a global silk shortage, as we discussed a few classes ago, right? Partially because the silk grown in Europe, mostly in Italy, were from species that had been over a long time stagnant and inbred, and so they were weaker. And the Japanese silk had not gone through the process of mixing and then becoming inbred. It had just stayed mostly in Japan. They were a more resistant breed of silkworm, and they were not hit by this blight that comes to Western Europe. And so between silk and cotton, and of course other exports too, like copper, Japan is doing a lot of export and these kinds of things. But the issue is that apparently as this exporting becomes so huge for Japan, goods in Japan themselves become, so as they're meeting all this demand, right, and the prices are actually high elsewhere, it raises the price on goods in Japan. The people in Japan who work who make money in the trading industries or shipping industries, they become very wealthy at this time, and these are the people called the Narikin or the nouveau riche. They're the emblem of this development. And here we can see a very wealthy member of the nouveau riche, of the new rich here. Can you see what that is? That he's burning? Everybody see what that is? Money, yeah, Andre. So this is a 100 yen note, and he's basically saying, "Oh, here, I'll give you some light." So he's just burning money, right? So the people are seeing that happen as well. This is also the era during which the zaibatsu of Japan become extremely powerful. This one you've probably seen before. This is Mitsubishi, one of the major zaibatsu in Japan, or a financial clique. Zaibatsu essentially is a series of companies that all have the same central holding company. Usually it used to be sort of the same family, and they'll have a shipping company, a banking company, maybe a mining company, or some kind of a factory branch, but they are all working together. And this is a system that has been for Japan very successful. And Mitsubishi is one of them. This one here below is an older Mitsubishi. Actually, it goes back to the 1870s. Has anyone seen this before? This symbol before? This is the Mitsui Zaibatsu, which came about based on the Mitsui banking family that were banking the shogunate and then banking the new Meiji government. The first before there was a national bank. So Mitsubishi, Sumitomo are some of the ones that you may have heard of before, and they're still around today, although they have been broken up somewhat by regulations in the post-war period. So banking, trade, mining, et cetera, because they are so wealthy and so involved in these sectors that make money or that make war, they are very influential. They also go to they're also led by family members who have gone to the same elite schools as the people who are in the government. So the top administrators who went to the Imperial University or to Keio or Waseda, they were, alongside these various zaibatsu companies' top sons. And so they're part of the same boys' club, so to speak. And they're interested in obviously making money, but they're also interested in how they can expand Japan's empire. This is pretty much across the board a common goal for the zaibatsu, and if need be, also how they can be involved in making war. And about 1/5 of Japan's economy by 1923 is made up of commerce or industry run by the zaibatsu. Yeah, RJ.
Would these zaibatsu be comparable to like the corporations we have today, like Amazon
That's a good question, Rajay. I mean, they tend to be in industries that are like all tied together. So I think Amazon and Google and other companies have managed to tie things together that actually don't go together because they can just use search engines and I don't know other ways to link things together. These things are they're much more closely tied together, but in the sense of them being like everywhere and ubiquitous, that part I think is similar. Everyone in Japan knew Mitsui or Mitsubishi, and they knew what they did, and they knew if they wanted any of these 10 things, like nickel or chemicals for fertilizer or coal, they knew which one to go to, right, for that. Interesting question. Yeah, I never thought of that before. So while they're getting very wealthy, the rest of Japan is not doing as well with issues of inflation and with a lot of protest. 1920 was actually a year of Japan's first stock market crash. The end of this inflationary cycle was a crash in the stock market. Basically, it is basically it is a period of speculation. It happens a lot. We've seen it in the US a lot of times with real estate market speculation. The prices for things had been high. They got a little bit lower, but people, a lot of different companies purchased real estate at artificially high prices, hoping that eventually the demand would actually would match on the graph. It would sort of match these high prices. Some commodities also had the same goals, but in most of these cases, it was not successful. The real estate market, as well as the commodity markets, they did not do well in 1919, and so the stock market crashed in Japan in 1920. Class about the Great Kanto earthquake, this major earthquake that you read about in your books that caused so much devastation, so much catastrophe, so much homelessness, and that caused also the collapse of the banking industry for a short time. Talked about that, right? And you can imagine the consequences that this would have on the rest of Japan beyond Tokyo and Yokohama, where most of the banks are used to be located. I showed you some pictures so you could see also this devastation up close. Major moment for Japan. And we also talked about the ways in which this catastrophe was linked to previous and then subsequent loan problems, right? With the 1920 first depression that Japan enters, and then this happens, and then the second sort of issuance again of nationwide, a lot of banks trying to survive by giving out loans to whoever they can find. They're not. They're sort of risky loans, right? They're loans to people whose credit would not qualify them for a loan normally, which obviously will result in things like a failure to pay back the loan. Not those, again, who are going to major universities. I want to focus again on people who are not doing so well. So most of Japan at this point in time is still made up of people who are agricultural laborers. We've talked about various different classes. I want to focus for a bit now on the rural classes. Who we're talking about. So the numbers are pretty hard to pin down, but in 1910, 1920, we still have more than half of the people in Japan are part of the rural classes. They work and live outside of these major urban areas. And so they are not, they have their own story, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So they're in these rural areas, there is a landlord class, right? And they do have some wealth, usually from having people working as tenants on their land. One second, William. And then they also have sometimes wealth from generations of their own farming, right, and success. Some minor money lending going on as well, and banking. But these people, they're sort of the rural elite, and there's some really great research that's been done about these individuals. and how they really work to try and bring modernization on their own terms to their various communities. So they're there, and we also have owner farmers who are not quite as wealthy, but these are people who own their own farms, small farms, but they are able to use their farms to not just subsist, but also to make enough of profit to keep this going. But most people working in agriculture are tenant farmers, and they're the ones who are going to be the sort of the ones who are the most visible, the ones who are the most often suffering, and the ones who are going to attract the most attention. So yeah, I saw your hand up, William.
I was just going to say that 60% of the Japanese population.
Yeah. Japan has been, since, I don't know, time immemorial, a largely agricultural nation, and that has not changed. What does change, though, is that now there is more of a desire amongst the working class, those who are working in the fields and such, as they see, there should be a you here, sorry, those who see all that's happening in Japan, right, to be able to get on that train, right, to be able to go to the capital, to be able to work in other kinds of professions. And we also see the rise, as I mentioned a few classes ago, right, of this enormous print capitalism that is just changing Japan so much. This also reaches the countryside, in some ways also indirectly. So this is actually a book written by a poet who was really surprised when he went when he traveled through the countryside at how people were living. And he, having lived much of his life in Tokyo, he was actually relatively young. I think he was at this point in his 20s. Seeing people working so hard, it really made him sad, and he didn't understand why there was this disconnect between the life in the capital that was so great and then the life in the countryside. And so he basically did this long, he wrote it's a novel, but it's based entirely upon people that he did meet in Kosho, which is a small rural farming village in Japan. And this is published in the top paper of Japan, the Asahi Shimbun, over the course of a couple of years, and then becomes a book afterwards. And this novel, right, really brings attention to just how much people in the farming class are suffering, their cracked hands, the high rates of infant mortality, as well as maternity, like mothers dying in childbirth, the heavy toll of the work on the farmers' bodies, all these things that are, I think to be somewhat expected, are amplified, right, in this book. So what we see is this book and other kinds of documentation on the working class, on the farming class in Japan, it catches the eye of those who are looking to try and make this modern, industrializing Japan like a more egalitarian, right, a fairer place to live. Those who are influenced by things like socialism in particular and other Western concepts from Russia and from France. They're going to use this kind of story to try and argue that Japan is not doing its duty to those who are at the bottom of society. And at the same time, we see that the farming people in rural Japan also are going more and more to school. They're more and more literate, and they are able to themselves read this book if they want to, but they don't want to read the book. But they're also able to sort of get information about, ways to perhaps become more proactive and to change their situation. And so they do band together to form the first Japan Farmers Union in 1922, which is still very powerful today, and which really had the goal of trying to create this sense of farmer class identity and then the ability to mobilize against oppression if need be. I also want to discuss another group that we haven't talked about. I'm kind of pulling things from the last, like readings from last class and from today. I want to pull them all together into one lecture. I want to talk about the Burakumin. So it's Burakumin. This is a social class in Japan, and it is a class of people who traditionally have been the ones to do the dirty jobs, both dirty, actual dirty jobs, but also jobs that involve like ritual pollution, so handling things like leather and dead animals and those kinds of things. These communities have been around since the 1400s in Japan, doing this kind of work at the very least. And because of their importance to society, they actually were able sometimes, to make requests and have a good amount of autonomy in the Edo period. But as we get to this new modern era, right, things accelerate, and the promise of class liberation is there, right, with the decree that liberates all the classes in 1876. But these members of this class are not liberated really, right? They have several names. This name Burakumin kind of means like rag pickers, so they kind of have this this reputation of being people who will pick up things and use things that no one else wants anymore. And they're liberated, but this does not mean that the stigma that comes with people knowing like where they come from in a city, because every city has neighborhoods that are tied to this group, right? This stays with them. Their last names, when they get last names in the 1880s, that will stay with them as well. So we start to see this sort of prolonged stigmatization happening and continuing amongst them. And we even see that the last names and addresses of people who are burakumin are actually kept on lists. And so if you want to go to university or if you want to get a job, right, they'll check this list, right, to see if you might be belong to this class. They still are being, unfortunately, discriminated against quite a bit. And so they established their first self-help organization in 1900 to try and mutually give sort of insurance, loans, because no one else is doing this for them. And then if we fast forward to 1920 or thereabouts, we see that they begin to organize on a national level, right? So kind of in parallel with the farmers, we have the unclass or the burakumin creating the suisha or the levelers society. I want to also mention one last group that we haven't talked about, and they're also involved in this sort of new disconnect between modernity and industrialization and all these benefits, and on the one hand, on the other hand, with discrimination and poverty. And these are Koreans in Japan. So we'll talk about them a bit more again next class, but I want to just talk about them briefly here and introduce you to to this class of people in Japan. So 1910 is the year that Japan, well, do you know what happens in 1910? Yeah, William?
Korea is officially annexed by the Empire of Japan.
Yeah, so this is the year in which Japan actually takes Korea and makes it part of Japan officially, right? It is a colony, so it's not equal, but under this policy, Koreans are Japanese citizens, all of them. There's a lot of rhetoric about how to make this work, and one of the important ideas is the idea of the dosoran, which means sort of common descent, a theory of common descent, which argues that the Koreans and Japanese have the same descent or the same genealogy, and therefore they are ethnically compatible. Not everyone believes this, obviously, but there are some who make this argument quite heavily and strongly. And then there are those who think that they're common enough in descent that the Japanese advanced level and the Korean less advanced levels are incompatible, and so Japan has a responsibility to help their sort of brothers, right, in terms of sort of ethnicity, to achieve Japan's level. This is the sort of very common like civilizing mission of the imperialists that we see here, and they use this theory and those like it to justify it. So they are citizens. They can go to Japan if they can afford to, and I'll mention that many of them do go to Japan from Korea. And they are they're supposed to have enough ethnic commonality with Japanese to be able to live and work in Japan and to assimilate. And the reality is, though, when they come to Japan, they get the title of Zainichi, which basically means staying in Japan, or like a foreign resident staying in Japan, usually temporarily. And this title stays with Koreans, even though they've been in sometimes Japan for 10, 20, 30 years. Even though they are officially Japanese citizens, they stay Zainichi. So 1910 is the first official year, right, of Japan's colonization of Korea, and we already have over 2,500 Koreans who are in Japan by that point. We're talking mostly about people working, moving as migrant labor to work in Japan, with men working without their wives and families at that point. In 1930, we're over 400,000. We have many more Koreans who have come as workers to Japan. And they've, over the course of the 20s, they've brought their families also to live with them in Japan. In 1925, just to give you an idea, mostly Koreans are migrating to major metropolitan areas. So 10% of Osaka's population and 50% of Fukuoka's population. Fukuoka is the biggest city on the island of Kyushu. They are Korean migrants or Korean residents or Korean even citizens, right? So these are pretty big numbers. And despite that, we still we don't see them being given, well, having a very good time. So how are they doing in Japan? How is it going for them in these cities? Mostly the Koreans who come to Japan during the late Meiji and then throughout the Taisho and early Showa periods come from southern Korea. So areas that can access the port of Busan, right? Chola province in particular, and they are farmers for the most part. And so when they come from Korea, they are mostly not coming from a situation of wealth or high education. They're mostly poorly educated and they're mostly illiterate, which limits what they can do in Japan. And they go to Japan to find a better life than they can have in their own country and to try and make good on the promises of colonization. They always find themselves doing manual labor, like many people in Japan as well, who are Japanese by sort of who are Japanese ethnically. But there are some differences, right? The Koreans, they slide into the lowest possible jobs, right? Because of their ethnicity. They work in the mines. As haulers, the haulers don't actually pick the coal, for example. They just carry it around, and so the profit that you would get from bringing coal that you've hewed off, off of the rock, is much less. Is almost for these people at that level inexistent. So in many other examples, we see them taking the worst possible jobs, right? And because of their Zainichi status, they also oftentimes are fired often, right, and shifted around a lot, or they choose to change jobs because things are so terrible. So they often change jobs a lot, and these kinds of changes make it hard for people to make a living and also to maintain enough longevity in the job to then have any sort of promotion. So this is also an important thing to remember. They have lower wages than their Japanese coworkers. Think about in the U.S. today how a woman is paid less than a man for the same job. For example, right, here we have a situation in which Koreans doing the same job, sometimes even better, higher level jobs than their Japanese coworkers are paid less systematically. And you can imagine, right, that this comes along with a feeling of being targeted, of being unfairly treated, and of wanting to sort of work together and lived even close to each other. So there is some natural community building that happens. But we also see quite a bit of the people and neighbors pushing, and also officials pushing Koreans to live together. And so what began as sometimes, what's the word now, like affinity housing, right, with people who are Korean or Korean descent living close to each other for comfort, for shared food and cultural practices, it becomes a policy of ghettoization. And you know, you can still find some of these places in Japan today where Koreans have been pushed and forced to live. I don't speak Korean, but I've read that the term tongnye is the term that is used for these parts of major cities in Japan that have this going on. Things that are quite a bit different, but it all goes back to the practices that discriminated against Koreans and made it impossible for them to live, you know, anywhere else. And as we'll discuss again next class, there is a lot of anti-Korean racism in Japan. Koreans are treated as inferior, as less intelligent, as lazy, as I don't know, all these kind of things we can associate with Thursday. Last class we talked about some controversial thinkers, and we decided that they probably should not be allowed to keep doing what they're doing. We'll come back to them next class. Today we're going to talk about some ideology that's also in the background that's going to be more important, but I also want to highlight some important trends. So, if you recall last class, we talked about this, the rise of this figure, the first commoner prime minister and the first party or party-dominant prime minister, Harake. And we talked about also the ideas of Yoshino Sakuzo and Minoru Tatsukichi and Hitaiki. So we have these competing, right, versions of the national polity and what it should look like. And Taisho democracy, you know, in Japanese scholarship, they use this term a lot, right? This period of sort of like this effervescence of just great, progressive, oftentimes democratic ideals that are just flourishing, right? And it's fine. Some of which, some of these are also not quite as democratic, but they're also allowed to coexist. And as we also mentioned last class, right, the year 1922 is a big year for advancements in labor rights and labor protections, and women are also getting new rights as well, the right to attend political meetings. So again, things seem to be going that direction. We also discussed male suffrage for all men over 25, not on welfare, big change, and we also discussed, however, the backside of that, the next day, actually the same day, the publication of the Peace of Police Law, which makes it illegal to talk or to publish or to try and act to alter the national polity or the kokutai. Very vague and potentially dangerous language. So let's talk about where this goes. From 1925 or so onwards, we have these sort of two trends that we have these two different tracks, right? And they've sort of been around before, but they're going to really accelerate after 25. So I want to talk about two. We'll talk about the rise or the growth of collectivism and authoritarianism, right? Which we're talking about the various tools and strategies used by ideologues, those thinkers, writers, and the government to encourage people in Japan to think in terms of in a collective way. Like we Japanese, that's the priority, not me, the individual who wants a new car or who wants to get married for love, right? So this is a trend we're going to see more and more pronouncedly. We also see increasingly a recourse to authoritarianism, which basically just means that there is a figure or figures on top who give directions that are followed, and if they're not followed, the consequences of that are direct as well, right? And in this situation as well, the individual does not have the right to oppose the authority structure, right? So we'll see these coming about. And I want to focus on 4 different places in which different sort of other trends that are going on as well. And we'll see that in each of these ideas are also going to keep popping up more and more. So let's talk first of all about Western-style imperialism. And then we'll get back to ideology a little bit later. So we're going back now to 1915. We sort of talked about Japan's colonizing Korea in 1910 and how that started off, right? And we talked about that a little bit a few classes ago. For Japan to continue to grow as an imperialist power, they needed to think about their biggest neighbor, about China as well. China is very big. Japan did not intend to take over China. What they wanted to do, though, was to make China situate itself beneath Japan, right? Going back to the 1880s, we have this discourse of Japan being superior to China. And if you think back even to the sort of 1800 to 1830s, this time period, the discourse that was arguing that Chinese thinking and structures, all these things had actually weakened Japan. Does that ring a bell? Right? So here we see this idea coming back now in a very direct way, affecting policy. So the Prime Minister of Japan, Okuma Shigenobu, who you see on the right, and Foreign Minister Kato Takaaki, travel to China to discuss some things, and then they eventually lay out 21 demands that Japan has for China. And there's like 5 categories, right? So I'm just going to go through the 4 major ones here. These are all categories that are essentially going to try and informally imperialize China, right, under Japan. So Japanese consent is required for all Chinese or other countries as well, railroad building permits and loans. It's a pretty big deal, right? If anyone in China wants to build a railroad, they have to go through Japan or fund that project. Japanese companies have primacy in building schools, hospitals, and also temples. This is a nice way, thinking about government, how it functions, to ensure that Japanese companies, right, can go and do this work unimpeded. They can also make a profit, right? So this is again going to be to the sort of detriment of Chinese companies and workers in that context. And they also are focusing on things that for them represent, again, Japan's sort of intellectual superiority, right? Schools and hospitals. And this is also an effort to combat the influence in China of Westerners, right, who are building churches, who are building missionary schools, who are building missionary hospitals as well, right? So Japan wants to be doing that too, and they want to push other countries out if they can. They also tell China they're going to establish a Sino-Japanese police force. This means that Japanese advisors will come and tell China how to police itself in its cities, and they will be then part of the police force. And the same for the armory. They're going to also establish a joint armory, meaning that all weapons, massive weapons at least, are going to be controlled by a joint council of Japanese and Chinese military officials. So these are all things that the Chinese obviously felt very, I think, understandably, were unfair and problematic. And so, but it actually gets worse in some ways. They're going to also lease the South Manchurian Railroad zone for 100 years. And amongst all the ones I've mentioned so far, this is perhaps the most important. So if you look at the map of northeast China, the zone that is in question here is the zone that has been the source of contention between Russia and Japan for so many decades. This is access to the major ports of Manchuria, and Japan has been able to take over this part of China with some success, but now they are going to actually make it, they'll have a lease in which, and that means like during this period they will own this, essentially, own this property, right, for this short time. Have you heard of this kind of thing before happening in China? A territory that's leased for a super long time and it's run by a different government? Drew?
Hong Kong?
Yeah, Hong Kong, right? So Japan's just trying to follow the Western example. They're trying to do what Britain did, and they imposed this. And they also require that the Japanese in this territory will have extraterritoriality. So a word that they learned from Western imperialism in their own country. And they also claim control over Shandong, which is an area south of Manchuria, but an area that used to be controlled by Germany, an area which they actually thought that they had won with their earlier victory over China in 1895. So they're making good on some former promises. They're also trying to stake their claims in China in a very overt and straightforward way. So the Chinese response was relatively swift. They boycotted Japanese goods. They stopped so many of Japan's exports coming to China that it hurt the economy of Japan, 1915, 1916. All be that as it may, they were unable to stand up against all of these requests, right? So they agreed to 13 of the least aggressive. I'm not going to go into which ones they agreed to, but the result is that the informal empire of Japan in China does begin to take shape. This is way before we have official or unofficial colonization happening in the rest of China. We'll see that happening in Japan later on. And meanwhile, Great Britain, who has done these very same things, right, but earlier, begins to worry about Japan as a competitor in the global imperial game of power and territory. Oh, so yeah, I'm not sure. This is Shandong. And this is Manchuria here. We're talking about this zone here in particular, and the South Manchurian Railroad that was already being built and utilized in that territory. Okay, so let's talk now about Korea, just briefly, because this is going to be a still developing situation. So we talked about the annexation of Korea as part of Japan, and during the first decade, this control was relatively brutal, and the Korean efforts to introduce sort of more democratic interactions with the Japanese Governor General, they failed. And as you may or may not remember, the result of all these policies, along with the Korean response, which was to try and assert some national identity and independence, was the March 1st movement, 1919. And after this point, we go back to a little bit of a compromise. So we have a decade during which the Japanese worried largely about how they're being seen, right, by Western powers, as well as by potential colonies. They softened the rule, and so they begin to be more tolerant. They allow Korean language papers to be published, those kinds of things. They allow religion also to flourish in some different ways, both Christianity and Buddhism on its own. And and they also send many more Japanese to Korea. So kind of a mixed situation going on there. And in the 1930s, we have another shift towards a policy of one Korea and one Japan, nice and Itai, in which there's assimilation that is being, at this point, forced on the Koreans. There is not very much resistance anymore amongst the Koreans. They're clearly colonized and they are beaten. And so they accede to these changes, like their names are changed from Korean names to Chinese names. They go attend Shinto shrines, and we will see them drafted into the Japanese military, either as workers or as soldiers from the late 1930s. They go to work in mines and are treated essentially like work slaves in some contexts. And hopefully you've also gotten a hold of the book Barefoot Gen, which is a first-hand account of a Hiroshima survivor of the first atomic bomb that was dropped on Japan. And this is his narrative of his experience, and he, as you will see very soon, he has interaction with someone who is part of this this sort of bringing Koreans to Japan, making them work this policy. So now back to China, right? The same year, 2 months after the March 1st uprising of Koreans, we have the March 4th movement May 4th movement in China, in Tiananmen, in the capital, in which the Chinese react very strongly to Japan's clearly aggressive policies and efforts to subjugate their country. And so we will see the use of this square, Tiananmen, for the next century as a place to gather and protest and to and also in many cases to proclaim that China is not a colony, it is indeed an independent country. So Japan not doing so well, right, in terms of being able to rule without opposition in a way that will not attract negative media attention from the West, etc. More about the West here. So there was a question, I think, from William, I think, about Russia. So let's talk about that briefly, and we'll kind of move through these pieces as well. So during the First World War, Japan, as well as Great Britain and another couple countries, decided to intervene after the Bolshevik Revolution, and to go and try and to support the Tsar, or the Tsarist troops, I should say, right? The idea here is that a revolution of this nature, in which a monarch in a powerful country is overthrown by crazy rebels, right, is a dangerous precedent. And so we see the European countries as well as Japan stepping in to try and stop that from becoming the sort of the end result here. They're unsuccessful, as you can imagine. The Bolsheviks win, and this is how we end up with a new Russia. But the Japanese actually stay for a couple more years than they're supposed to stay, until actually 22 they stay in this area, and they keep fighting against these troops. And the questions here are, why were they staying, right? Lots of different explanations. They wanted to continue to benefit from the arms production that goes along with this kind of fighting. They wanted to continue to train the military, right, to be good at fighting. But they also want to keep weakening Russia, like as a whole, right? And so all these things are happening, again, not making Japan look very good for Westerners who think that they should just leave this country, which they don't. This image is an old one. I'm not sure what it's from. So I think it is actually a part of the Treaty of Versailles, the contingent, that goes to end the war. Sign the armistice that ends First World War. And one of the issues that your book mentions is that there is still this issue of Japan wanting to have Shandong as its territory, but not being given it. and Western countries thinking that it should stay a part of China and that they should all have access to it. It's to its ports and to its resources. This is the League of Nations. You've probably heard of this before. Pretty important organization. And the Japanese do attend and send delegates to this proposed group, this proposed organization, and they essentially are asking for President Woodrow Wilson, who is the original thinker behind this, and others to put in a racial equality clause, that all races are equal. Although the Japanese are not themselves making that claim about other races near them, they want this to be in the charter of this organization. Countries more powerful than Japan, and also the ones who drew up these documents, they refused to put that in there, right? So Japan joins, but has sort of lost their faith in this group's ability to be really inclusive. Now, this is happening in 1920. And we talked about how Japan is being perceived, right, by Western powers as a possible threat. It's only going to continue, this sort of worry about Japan. What are they going to do? And Japan continues to feel that they are not being treated equally to their Western sort of competitors or their Western fellow great powers. And so they decide to, in order to avoid some sort of a conflict, they decide to come together and to negotiate a simple agreement. So they go to Washington, D.C., and they discuss, it should be in front here, but they're sitting around this table here. They're discussing naval armaments. And the idea here is that they're all going to agree not to build above a certain amount of ships, of warships. And Japan had hoped that it would be a ratio of everyone will just sort of be 1-1-1, right? We'll all build the same number of warships. Great Britain and the U.S. would like to see Japan building less, to have them be able to build less in proportion to their own capacities. And so what we see is that they essentially push Japan to agree to build only 3 ships for every 5 that Great Britain or the U.S. builds. So this is, for the Japanese, a very difficult pill to swallow. They really don't feel like they should have to be treated or given less, like latitude to build great warships, to do like Western powers and use them as necessary to defend their country or to go and to conquer other countries. So it's really a very, this makes them very angry in Japan. Because there was going on at this point in time, there's already a depression, and because the year after that we'll have the great counter-earthquake, there's no revolution happening about this in Japan, but it is one of these sort of important steps that makes Japan very wary of Westerners and their ideals, in theory, of equality and a civilization. If we fast forward also and we just cross the ocean, we can see other reasons also why the Japanese are wary of Westerners. In the US, in particular, the sort of sentiment towards Japanese is very palpable and it's very negative in many cases. So I didn't talk about this much, but from the 1880s, we have Japanese going to work in Hawaii on plantations that are underpeopled, that lack enough workers, especially with the decimation of the Hawaiian population by disease. And so they go to work in Hawaii, and we also have them, along with other East Asian workers, especially from China, going to work as well on the continent in the United States, thinking about in the field of agriculture, but also on the railroads that are crossing the country. They are laborers who have come to fill this great need that the U.S. had for these kinds of workers, right? So the number becomes great, and so the first step that the U.S. takes to try and deal with the influx of Asian immigrants is to tell them to stop coming. But Japan and the U.S. come to an agreement under President Roosevelt that they won't officially make it illegal for Japanese to immigrate to the United States. They'll just agree amongst themselves that Japan will have a certain quota, and afterwards they will not send more or allow more immigrants to come to the United States. That's 1907. And between that date and the 1922, we see a progression of things happening, especially on the West Coast of the United States. Japanese settle and they work and they succeed. They go to school alongside other Americans. And in that context, we see the increase of contact, but also of racism against Japanese Americans. And this is going to keep building and building. And this sign, as you can see here, is, I think, pretty clearly emblematic, right, of what they're trying to accomplish. The racism against Japanese uses stereotypes about their work ethic, but also truisms about their ability to work and succeed in this new area. And it's met also with, sometimes the less successful work ethic of their neighbors, or less studiousness of their neighbors. And so these things create a lot of negative sentiment from the white population of California, of Washington State and Oregon. And so they're going to keep continuing to try and push for separation. And in fact, the national government actually intervenes, and in part to help protect Japanese Americans, they begin to push them to not go to the same school as their white neighbors. Because there were attacks, a lot of racist attacks happening. There were a lot of intimidation being done. There was a lot of practices that were discriminatory happening as well. It was a very bad situation. But over time, the government stopped giving Japan any special treatment at the national level, and these issues just keep getting worse and worse. So that in 22, the national government, the federal government, actually prohibits Japanese naturalization. So that means you can come to the United States, but you cannot become a citizen. You can just stay and work because the U.S. needs your work, but we don't want you to actually be a citizen. And the Supreme Court rules that this is actually legal and it's fine. And then in 24, the Immigration Act is actually going to prohibit immigration from Japan, especially from China, but also from Japan. So it's an anti-Asian immigrant Immigration Act, and these kinds of things are, at this point, the Japanese who are in Japan, Japanese who are in Hawaii, and those who are in the United States, they're all very much in conversation with each other. They're sending maybe like a relative to go work in one of these places, and then they're writing back. So they're well aware of these kind of issues, and it just adds to the resentment that they have about the so-called West, right? That is so civilized and that refuses to give them like equal status. I wanted to take a second and sort of go away from the book's topics, because I work a lot on this time period. There's some cool things happening that we should also be aware of, thinking also about imperialism. One of them is that the Japanese government has they've understood, right, that just sending people to colonize a country or just sending soldiers is not successful, and so they're trying to find other ways. And using Western models, they are doing that through various means. One of those means is by sending like missionaries. So I'm going to talk about one just briefly. This is Takeda Hanshi, who was a Soto Zen Buddhist priest in Japan. He went to Korea and to Manchuria several times on his own just to sort of look around and to sometimes make deals with people who are already there to try and promote perhaps, in his view, the direction in which these territories should move. And he works, I'll mention someone in a bit, in a few minutes who was closely working with, who was more political. But anyway, so he has this sort of shady role in the 1890s. And then he comes back to Japan, and he's convinced that he needs to go to Korea and to make Korean Buddhism strong. At this point in time, and actually since around 1600, I think it is, the Buddhist priests have been forced to leave the capitals and the major cities and to live outside the cities, right? So they are in monasteries. Compared to Japan or China, Buddhism is not a wealthy religion, and the priests and monks are not doing very well. And so he, having seen this, wants to go back, and he wants to bring Buddhism in Korea up to a higher standard, right? Yes, Adam.
Was there another religion in Korea competing with Buddhism that made that happen, or did it just decline on its own?
So it was actually not based, so there was also another religion. So at this point in time, there is a combined religion, kind of that, it's called Chonnogyo, which kind of builds off of some of the ideals of the Donggak movement back in the 1800s. But that movement is sort of, it's there, and there also is a lot of Protestant missionaries as well who are present as well from the US and from Canada who are also making converts. So good questions. But the real issue was that, 4 centuries before, Buddhism was very influential, right? And they were trying to find a way to get it out of the world of politics. And so they were sort of banished to the periphery from urban centers. And so he thinks he can go back and fix this. And he thinks that his mission, in particular, he's a Soto Zen priest, is the one to do this. And so he begins making trips and trying to meet with Buddhist priests and monastery leaders to try and promote this Japanese oversight of a new Buddhism. And they, in some ways, encourage him to come and help with new Buddhism, right, and renewing Buddhism. But it gets interesting because then the government, both at the level of the Japanese Governor General in Korea, as well as the foreign minister of Japan, begin to give him money to go, right? Thinking that perhaps if we can make Buddhism better, we as Japanese, right, then this will help to sort of soften the blow of our colonizing this country. They aren't saying that, but that's what their actions show. And the same thing is actually happening as well with Christianity in Japan. So my first book is partially about this figure here on your left. And he is somewhat important in this story, but his sort of protege, Watase Tsunekichi, is more important to this story. So he goes to Seoul, and he works as a teacher there, and he becomes convinced that Christianity can do the same kind of thing. They can help to improve the lives of the Koreans, right, and their level of civilization. But he would like to see it be Japanese and not Western Christianity that does this, right? And because there are so many like official ties, because Korea is a colony, but also because of the sort of linguistic and cultural ties like Confucianism, he thinks that this will be a better fit. And so he comes back from Korea. He's a pastor of a church, the Kobe Church, and then he begins to develop a very strong mission project to go and like preach Christianity in Korea, but Japanese Christianity. And they build hundreds of churches, which are not only for Japanese, but also for Koreans. Again, though, this is very clearly at least related to the imperial project. Japan's a larger imperial project, right? And so, to make a long story longer, basically these efforts, the government also gives him money as well, right? And says, yeah, sure, go do that, right? And so we see this sort of multi-pronged approach to making colonization a little bit more palatable for people in Korea who are being colonized. The book talks about, I think the book mentions that there sort of seemed to be, there was like two tracks, right? There was like, you know, we need to colonize quickly or slowly. We need to expand quickly or slowly. There was no sort of pacifist track, and that's not exactly the case. There were Christians, there were some Buddhists, and there were some intellectuals who thought that this whole thing was problematic, and they were vocal about it. And up until 1920, we see this kind of expression of dissent about empire published in publications that were sometimes not even actually not even censored, right? They were allowed to be published. But it's after 1925 when we really do see that there is a change, right? You cannot publish that kind of discourse anymore, and that does change dramatically. So let's get back now to ideology. So that was about Western imperialism, and part of what's fueling these overtures towards softer colonization and to collaboration and to take over through these more indirect or informal processes rather than by force are ideologies that are actually very much about Japan, not about Korea or Manchuria. So I want to shift now and go from talking about Western-style imperialism, talking about the ideologies that are, like I mentioned at the beginning, I mentioned radical ultranationalism with an S. So we're going to go back in time a little bit again, just because things are, it works that way sort of thematically. You've probably heard before of like Japan being, or maybe you haven't heard, but Japan is sometimes referred to in the Meiji period or in pre-war Japan as like a family state, right? Like that the emperor is the father figure of the country, people are his children, and that the family is the most important unit, and that its sort of perpetuation is the priority, right? And so thinking back to Confucianism, right, the children owe obedience and loyalty to the father, and the father owes benevolence and is responsible for the children. This idea is first, though, crystallized in the 1890s. So another professor at the Imperial University, we talked about a few last class, but this is someone who actually preceded them. His name is Hozumi Yatsuka. He wrote a book called Patriotism, National Education in 1897. And this is really a fantastic example of how Western ideas and this new nationalism are really going to create something very different in Japan. So he actually had studied abroad in Berlin. He was a legal scholar. He was very interested in the ideas also of like the ideas of like absolute monarchy that were popular and that were being brought back sometimes in the 1800s in Great Britain. So the emperor being the most important, or in this case, in other cases, the king being the most important figure in a country. And he has these ideas, but he also believes that Shinto is sort of the key that could make this work for Japan. So this book basically uses the Shinto sort of terminology, right, and hierarchy to organize and define the essence of Japan's kokutai, or body politique, the national body. The emperor, in his view, is the essence of it, right? And so he is above all important. He uses the term family state for the first time as a defined term and as a policy goal, right, in his writings. He argues that Japan is an ethnic nation and that to be Japanese means that you belong to this nation. Have you ever heard before of this term, ethnic nation? Andre?
Kind of count as that, or no?
It could, right? I think it's a bit complicated because of Israel is composed of many different groups that come together, right? but it's definitely in response to another ethnic nation that had this terminology as its goal, right? So Nazi Germany also, right, this idea of ethnic nationalism and belonging to a country because you are of a certain ethnic background, right, and a shared ethnic background. This is what he's picked up on in Germany, and he likes the idea. Right? In Japan, for him, represents the ideal example of this because they are mostly, in his view, of the same ethnicity, the Japanese. So these ideas come together in this book, and he published this book in 1897, and these ideas are not right away part of mainstream thought. But as we move on in time, and as we move to like 1910, 1920, right, we see that these ideas are more and more, they are more functional for the government and more accepted. If we fast forward a little bit to the 1910s and 1920s, we can talk about two different figures who take these ideas and sort of work on them some more and adapt them a little bit. So one is a professor at the Army Academy and also at the Academy of the Navy in Tokyo. And occasionally he gives talks at the Imperial University. He built on these ideas a little bit, but essentially he's trying to argue that, so I'm talking about this figure named Uesugi Shinkichi. He argues that these ideas are a little bit too limiting. And they're not very pragmatic. So for him, it's important to understand that there is, the emperor actually does have desires and will, and he has agency, right? And so first and foremost, the country of Japan should be doing what the emperor wants, not what his cabinet wants, not what the Privy Council is pushing him to do, but what the emperor wants. He also feels that all these party politicians are sort of mudding the imperial will, making it harder to actually see what the emperor wants to get done. He's saying these things at a time when the Taisho emperor himself is actually someone who has some mental disabilities and is not actively doing a lot of ruling. So it's more of a theoretical at this point in time, but anyway, that's where we are. So he wants to get rid of all the party politics. He wants to get rid of all of the parties and work towards more unity. He also thinks that Japan is working towards becoming more democratic in a way that's going to perhaps be a problem in the future. Too much democracy, too much popular voice. Again, these things are all making it harder to hear the imperial will, or what the emperor really wants to happen. And we'll see this figure again in a little bit, but I wanted to mention the Imperial Way faction, which is a group of officials who find this ideology, which they've been hearing at the Army and Navy Academy, to be convincing, and they will use this as a motivation to go and put to put a plan into action that will help to make these things happen. And I'll mention one more person here, and that is Kakeihi Katsuhiko, another professor at the academies and at the Imperial University. Another sort of version of the family state now that we're trying to sort of move again in a different direction, but on many of the same bases. The key idea for Kakeihi is that there is no individual, that every Japanese person is part of the Japanese nation as a whole, and that we can only act in the interest of the whole. This idea is common to other states a bit later in history. Have you heard of any states that might have this kind of ideology? The idea that the individual doesn't matter, but only the group matters. Yeah, Andre?
Soviet Russia?
So that you could talk about that in that sense. Yeah. That might become, in the end, the result. But at the beginning, I would say that there's also some debate about how that should be applied. But I think that at some points in history, it definitely does apply there. Yeah. Tico?
The U.S. during the Cold War, in terms of rhetoric, like, ask not what you need to do for your country, ask not what your country needs for you.
Yeah, definitely the U.S. as well, right? So this is not unique to Japan, right? This is an idea that we oftentimes tie to fascism, right? Or to Italy, fascism comes from the term for a bundle of sticks because they're all together, like the fasce, right? So this is the idea here of the individual being sort of sublimated into a greater whole, and that's their whole entire existence. They get to claim that, but we see it actually we see it in the USSR, we see it in the US, and we saw it in Japan as well, right? Very important. He also argues that Japan needs to be proud of itself as a country, nothing too new there. He argues the most important duty of any person in Japan is imperial loyalty, and to act upon that loyalty. But he also mentions that Japan has a destiny, right, that is clearly its destiny, and that's a destiny to help Asia to develop and to control parts of Asia. And he also writes about the emperor being head priest of Shinto, which he was in a very figurative sense, right, a very symbolic sense, but not a real sense. And he wants to make it sort of a real thing. So these ideas are also going to be taught and mixed in with other more pragmatic thoughts at the Army and Navy academies, and they will become influential for other officials later on who will be part of the so-called control faction. So keep that in mind for the future. And let's go to, let's go, this will be our last slide for today, our last two slides. So I've talked about ideology, right? I talked about the Shinto symbolism that was being used and that grew out of the sort of the family state ideology and would eventually become part of the motivation for soldiers to challenge the social and political order later on. And I also mentioned some missionaries who were going to Japan's colonies and trying to soften the blow of colonization, but also to sort of help these countries, in their view, to improve in terms of religion, but also in terms of so-called civilization. I want to mention one last sort of line of connection between Japan's colonies and Japan, and these are sort of secret societies, of which the most famous one was the Genyosha. Well, actually, these two are actually related, but originally this is the Genyosha, and this is a group of officials, but mostly they're sort of thinkers and people and also entrepreneurs, and their goal is to honor the imperial family, but also to help Japan to have an empire. So they're negotiating and sort of having backroom deals to figure out ways that they can work together. The Taisho democracy period that roughly corresponds to the Taisho period in the history of modern Japan. We talked about the fact that the first prime minister that belonged to a party and was chosen by the party, his party, the Seiyukai, became prime minister, and that was Harake. In 1918, we talked about also Yoshinosaka, I think he was a commoner, right? We talked about the Christian law professor who put forth this idea of popular democracy in the 1910s and 20s that was very popular and that essentially put governance by a constitution and by a largely, if possible, universal suffrage, universal male suffrage body as the way to move forward. And we also talked about his colleague at the Imperial University, Minobu Tetsukichi, who himself had another idea, if you'll recall, the organ theory, right, of the emperor being the head and the rest of the body being the parts of the government and the people of Japan, and essentially trying to move away from the idea the emperor was above and separate from the rest of Japan. So these ideas are typical of Taisho democracy. They kind of embody the progressive, more democratic tilt that was present at the time. And if you'll recall, the victories that we talked about before in the 20s, the founding of the Communist Party, the removal of Article 5, which allowed women, which not allow women to attend political assemblies. That was removed. We talked about those kinds of things. We talked about the 25 passage of universal suffrage for all men in Japan who are 25 or over and who are not on welfare or criminals or homeless. So this was one direction, right? And Taisho Japan really is a moment where Japan had a choice, essentially, looking back now, right? They could go this direction or they could go a different direction. In last class we talked about this other part that was sort of building up in the first decade of the 20th century in Japan, that was much more reactionary and that was looking to try and bring a lot of Shinto ultranationalist ideas into more pragmatic and applied strategies. We talked about Hozomi Yatsuka, also at the Imperial University in Tokyo, who put the idea of the family state as a priority and the emperor as the head of the family state, and that Japanese, based on their ethnicity, all belong to and are directly tied to the emperor and owe him loyalty and obedience. Talked also about the Taisho era popular ideas, increasingly so, of Uesugi Shinkichi and Kakehi Katsuhiko, who both taught at the Army and Navy academies in the capital, and who essentially took these ideas from a few decades before and made them even more pragmatic, but also tried to bring a more sort of popular, like bringing the people of Japan closer together and in closer contact with the emperor, and removing the individual in one case, or removing those politicians who are corrupt and who are in the way of the imperial will and blocking the people of Japan from their emperor. So these are sort of competing ideas that are also around, and they get more popular in the Taisho period as well. And so part of what happens is we see that even before the end of the period in 26, the passage of the Peace Police Law, along with the Universal Male Suffrage Law, really sort of gives us a hint that things are not going to go the liberal, progressive, democratic direction. The next period, I thought I would just sort of clarify that, is the Showa period. It's a very long period, longer than the Meiji period even, and this is the reign of Emperor Showa. The Showa emperor is, his first name was Hirohito, and here we see him at his coronation, or his, what's it called? Coronation in 28, wearing the high priest of Shinto robes as well. He is the son of Emperor Taisho, who died relatively young, and who was not very active as an emperor, and had some issues mental issues that made it hard for him to actually be directly involved in ruling. His reign lasts from 26 to 89, so a very long reign. In fact, this is the longest reign of any Japanese emperor ever, or empress, and one of the longest reigns of any monarch in the world in recorded history. And he's going to be much more proactive. He's already 26 or so when he takes the throne, and so he is more proactive in government, and we'll see him a few times actually stepping in today's lecture. And here we see him also as very actively present in parades and military activities as well at home. So I wanted to give some information here also, that's more background. So part of why Japan does sort of shift to the right has a lot to do with the economic situation happening in Japan at this time. So do you guys recall what happened in 1920? There was a shock, right? A big economic shock and a depression. And then there was a big event happened also in 23. That was pretty bad. Anybody recall what happened in 23? September 1923. There was a great they came after the event, which was a earthquake. Yes, that's a big earthquake, right? So they already have had these two big dramatic events before we get to the Great Depression that affects the rest of the world in 29. So Japan also is impacted by this as well, right? They're going to be devastated by the Great Depression and the second crash of 29, but they also have already been trying to rebuild after two other major disasters. So, these are things from your book. Prices of commodities drop tremendously. Landlords have to go back themselves to farm, and they tell the tenants to take a hike. We see wage cuts also that are very, very high as well, very big. We see big skyrocketing in unemployment, and we see lots of strikes as well, and unrest. So if you can imagine, there's this balancing act going on, right, between the left and the right, or progressive and more democratic policies and possibilities, and the other direction is of more reactionary and more conservative, and hopefully safer and less volatile politics, right? And people are starving, they are unemployed, they are unhappy, and now they're even protesting in a way that they haven't done for almost, sometimes as many as 10 years before. We haven't seen this kind of protest happening. So keep that in mind. One of the most famous stories that your book also mentions is the story of the chimney man at the Fuji Spinning Company. I think it's actually in the capital. Anyway, he protests, but he actually goes up in the chimney of the spinning factory on a day that the emperor is going to pass by. This even gets, in Australia, attention as well. It's a really big event, and it just sort of exemplifies the large nature, but also the visibility of this problem of protest, right? That comes back again in the 20s, and that really is worrying the governing elites in Japan. Meanwhile, the Zaibatsu, right, these big companies like Mitsui or Mitsubishi, Nissan, these big companies, who we'll see some of them after the war again, they're still around, they have the idea of, they can see what's happening, they can see what's going to happen, they've already been through a few different crises, and they actually trade their yen for dollars in 30, realizing that the yen is going to be going down in value, and then they buy back the yen when they're very, very cheap. This has to do with the gold standard. I won't go into all that today, but this is a very smart but not very kind move, and it really shows that they were able to make do with the situation and to live pretty well. Zaibatsu do not go out, they prosper during the Great Depression. And at the same time, everyone else in Japan, those who are working in fields and working in industry, they are the ones who suffer tremendously. And so we see that the Zaibatsu are unhappy. We'll see the military are happy, I should say. And the military, we'll get to them in a second, they're also very much trying to make the best of the situation. And meanwhile, the people of Japan, who are mostly belonging to the farming and laboring classes, they are not doing so well. We have this friction or this tension between these two different groups. Perhaps like the last hope for a progressive or semi-progressive direction for Japan was the election of Prime Minister Hamaguchi Osachi, who we see here. Himself a party politician who then creates with others a new party that is the Minseito is a popular party, and it's a party that really tries to build off the momentum of the Taisho democracy period that has preceded it. They want to give people actually civil rights, which are not which are sort of dubious even in Japan's Civil Code of 1899. This party is going to be in favor of a lot of bilateral cooperation with the Western countries, and also even perhaps with China. This party is also one that is trying to, like right now in our state right now, remove wealth concentration amongst just the top elites and to try and share more of the wealth. So it's trying, in a sense, to bring the ideas of urban middle class individuals who are sick of riots but who don't want to see revolution happen, to find a middle path. And this is actually successful because it's not that scary to those who are more conservative, and those who are progressive see this as their only option. So he is elected on this, and so he has this opportunity, and they are challenging the Seiyukai, which at this point has become closely allied with the major Zaibatsu of Japan, as well as with the military, who are at the same time giving contracts to the Zaibatsu for machinery and materials, but also are themselves trying to gain from the territories conquered by Japanese imperialism. More on that in a bit. The downfall of this I would call it last major effort, comes in part because of the performance of Japan at the London Naval Conference, which the date's not here, but it's 1930. And 1929 is the conference, and then they signed the document in 1930. The prime minister at the time is, once again, Hamaguchi Osachi. And Japan had thought that they would be able to get perhaps even an equal ratio. If you think back to the Washington Naval Conference of 1922, right, Japan was willing to take a smaller proportion or ratio of major naval ship building vis-a-vis their Great Britain and the U.S., these two other major world powers, and they renegotiate in 29, but Japan again has to agree. They're pushed to agree to a lesser development than their Western allies or competitors, depending on how you see that. So this is seen by people in Japan as another slap in the face. Like the U.S. and Great Britain have again shown that they see Japan as inferior. They're again trying to exercise this sort of informal, imperialist approach to diplomacy with Japan, and it's not fair. And it also means that those who work in these industries and those who profit from these industries are going to suffer. But also it means that Japan's ability to wage war and also to use war to gain territory, which in theory should have financial positive impacts on Japan, will be lessened. So these are part of the things that eventually lead to Hamaguchi being he's actually shot. But that's part of the reaction to this is that he is shot. But he also has to step down because he fails to do a better job at negotiating a better treaty. And so when he leaves, there really is no pillar in the government that is pushing for progressive politics. There is essentially gradual or accelerated approaches to imperialism, and there is very little room for negotiation or protest. If you'll recall, I talked about some of these trends that we see, right? We talked about the increasing growth of collectivism, right? Or the belief that all are important and the individual is not important. We also talked about the growth of the idea of authoritarianism, which is the government has the right and means to decide and exert its influence and authority over the people, regardless of what they think, not seeking their opinion in any way, dictatorial political processes. And we talked about this, talked about imperialism a bit last class before that as well, as some of the things that are also happening, important trends. And these two trends we talked about before are very much tied to militarism, as well as the other two, I suppose, as well. If you think about, right, the fact that the people who are teaching at the Army and Navy academies, where the best students in Japan are learning to be soldiers or to be officers, that they are themselves writing books about the importance of the emperor and obedience to the emperor and Japanese ethnic national identity. These things all come together, right? And of course, you can imagine that Japan's expansion overseas and people being able to move to find a new life, but also people being able to get resources from these colonies is tied to Japan's military as well. So let's talk about that a bit more today. And see that as an overarching theme. So what happens, given that this is where we're going, what happens to these progressive voices who were so popular and so able to express themselves in the 1910s and 1920s? We can talk about a few things. The first thing that we start to see happening is the use of the peace police law to suppress dissent. Not just during an earthquake when we have, some leaders who are rounded up and assassinated in prison, like Ito Noe, for example, who we talked about classes ago, but a real government concerted effort to crack down on the relatively newly formed Japan Communist Party. There are major arrests in 28. and then there's a jailing of 500 of them. They're not killed. For the most part, they're just put in jail. But dissent is increasingly less tolerated, and this peace police law is a great tool. Those who oppose or pose a threat to the kokutai, or the national polity, and its sort of foundational concepts, whatever that means, right? They can be arrested or even, if necessary, killed. And we also see intellectuals, we see those who are accused of being communists arrested as well, right? The dangerous communist threat. We won't see this happening in the US until a bit later, but it does happen, right, as you may or may not know, with Senator McCarthy. So this worry about a threat to capitalism is not just an American invention. Japanese got to it first. And we also see the government, censors and officials, and trying to target Japanese thinkers as well, who might, or activists who might also be potentially disagreeing with the national polity. Is your hand up, William?
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay. So let's talk about these figures. How about our first individual? You all seem to think that we should probably give him a message that his ideas are not acceptable, right? And this was, I think, a relatively well-informed decision. As a censor, I found that to be convincing. And so what we do see is that he is fired from the Imperial University for proposing that the government should be led by democratic processes more than by the imperial word or the imperial authority of the emperor. And his society here that was established mostly amongst his students that he helped to nourish and helped them to go on and have other careers later on and write journals, this also is disbanded. That's one down. Across the hall, Minabe Tatsukichi, missing the S there again. This idea is even perhaps more controversial in that the emperor is somehow thought to be part of and not the entirety of the state, and part of the people of Japan, part of the national body along with people of Japan. The emperor being only an organ of the state could be controversial. And this Tenno Kikan Setsu, again also missing the S there, is deemed, as you all, I think, very well foresaw, as controversial. He also is fired. They're not put in prison. They don't go to jail. They're not assassinated, but they are not allowed to teach anymore or to write from the universities like this. And these are only a few. There are others. There are dozens of others, but these are the two most important figures whose ideas are not going to be allowed to continue to be propagated in Japan. And how about this other figure? We talked about this guy, Kitaiki. Another thinker. His ideas, they seem to not really belong in the category of progressive or in conservative. They kind of have a mixture of both, right? A lot of thinkers today would argue that extreme socialism and fascism are they kind of meet together at the end, right? With the kinds of means used and a lot of the ideas that are being put forward. And so that perhaps makes some sense. And in his ideas, we see a real mixture of things, right? If you recall, National Socialism, right? A government that will, from the top, rule for the good of all, but through probably a violent taking of power. People of Japan united with the emperor directly, right? This resonates with our Shinto ultranationalist who we just talked about last class as well. He believes very much in totalitarian authority, that the government has the right, once it is formed through a coup d'etat, to really exercise ultimate authority and to not be questioned. And he wants to liberate Asia and have Japan be the leading part of this sort of pan-Asian liberation movement. So we're not sure about him yet. He's still around in the 20s. He is not a professor. He's not very visible, but his writings are very visible. And he is not prosecuted or censored in any way. So just keep that in mind. So we talked about these Shinto ultranationalist military faculty, and I want to get to now how their ideas are impactful. So I want to talk first of all about the Imperial Way faction of the Kodoha, which was really based upon the ideas of the first of our figures. I can go back and show you briefly so we don't forget. Uesugi Shinkichi here, right? Which really vilifies party politics, which, to be fair, there is a lot of political negotiation happening, and there is room for frustration at that. So this is his name not here? This is General Araki. Where's his name? Yeah, on the top, sorry. So this is General Sadao Araki, who is he was a student of Uesugi Shinkichi, and he thought these ideas were very good. And he becomes himself a military training inspector, and then in 31, a Minister of War, and the same year a bit later on, he really takes these ideas to heart, and he sees a lot of need to unify the people and the emperor and the land of Japan as one, and morality being defined as acting towards that goal of unifying the individual and the state and the emperor in Japan. And he believes that violence is necessary, should be used to achieve these goals, and spiritual training or sort of ritual can be used to help train the mind and the body to achieve these things. And Shinto is part of this as well. So very much a Shintoistic set of arguments here. So he is the person who is essentially, he's like the headmaster, right, for military education, right, for many of the young men who are going to go fight over on the continent. Another figure I want to mention is Lieutenant General Nakata Tetsuzan. He was more influenced by the ideas of Kakeihi Katsuhiko, who we saw as well, whose ideas really have to do with erasing the individual within the greater entity of or mass of the national body. He's Minister of War after General Sadao. He becomes director in 34 of the Military Affairs Bureau, which is the office that deals with all of the personnel issues in the military. So who goes where, he's in charge of that. When there are complaints or issues, promotions, they all go through this bureau. So again, pretty influential. He has been a student of Kakeihi, so he has ideas that he is going to then pull from his past to then execute in real life, in real time. The key goals for Nagata are to create national unity, but also expansion. And the military should be the tool of this expansion, not some other sort of enterprise. And that the government should exercise direct totalitarian rule. This is how you get rid of all the party politics and negotiation, all of these things that actually are watering down Japan's potential to excel and become a rich nation and a strong country, and a unified country led by the imperial will. Now the difference, I want to also point out that between the Toseha and the Kodoha, there is a difference. It's a difference mostly in degree or in pace. So whereas the Imperial Way faction is for radical, direct transition, the Toseha, or the control faction, is for a gradual and reform-minded approach, right? No revolution, we're just going to fix things step by step to get towards this rule, towards this goal. And there are ways that we can introduce mechanization and modernization to make this happen. So they're different, but the goal, if you step back, is actually very similar. And the end result, if you look at their common goals, is also very much the same. So let me just get to that next. They have some important shared goals, right? They believe militarism. In other words, that the military should lead the country. This is valid, right, and should be implemented. They believe that Japan needs to expand over to the continent. Not just because they're a small country and they have a population that is larger than the livable and arable landmass, but also because this is how countries get strong, and they've seen it again and again by Western models demonstrated in their various imperial endeavors. They both also believe in totalitarianism, or that the state exercises total and unchecked control, and this is how we achieve the right outcomes, and that a Japan that is controlled by the military, that is expansionist, and that is governed through a system of totalitarianism can achieve Asian liberation, right? And this is an anti-Western idea, right? The West has been oppressing Asia. Japan's going to lead Asia out of this situation of being oppressed. But Japan has to be in the lead. They cannot be just one of other countries. They have to be the ones in charge of this. And what we also are able to see now that we have more hindsight is the extent to which the ideas of kita-iki have seeped into various parts of these ideologies. Soldiers, officers had oftentimes read parts of all of Kita-iki's a reorganization plan for Japan, but the theorists and officials at the high levels were the ones who definitely had read these books, and it's very visible. So we can see in a sense that these ideas are tied to his ideas, and that's important. We'll see in a little bit. They also both believe that the West is going to eventually have to be the enemy of Japan and of Asia, as they've shown it again and again, and as things like the London Naval Conference and Treaty demonstrated, right? The West is never going to consider Japan to be equal, and this is a problem. I want also to mention briefly Shinto, what's happening with Shinto as well. We talked about how Shinto became a non-religion a little bit, above other religions in the 1800s, and we talked about the Great Teaching Campaign, which on your exams many of you were able to talk about, so that was really good. But what's interesting is after the turn of the century, Shinto becomes something very different, much more proactive. The government has figured out how to use this umbrella, which is kind of empty, right, of state Shinto, to achieve very concrete goals. One of the most interesting stories in the history of Shinto is the shrine merger campaign. The government has made Shinto the uber religion, above religions, right? Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Shinto, whatever it is, you still have to be also believe in the key ideas of state Shinto, of which the emperor as the embodiment of heaven on earth and the connection between the people and the heavens, and that doesn't and they found ways to sort of remove things that might be too controversial. So anyway, the shrine merger campaign is one in which the government closes down about half the shrines in Japan. Now, they do this because they believe that they can use resources better to make the other shrines stronger. And they want to also have a more direct control over what kind of shrines are being visited and how they're used. A lot of shrine priests were pretty pissed off. They were like, "Wait, aren't we a state-funded religion? Why are we getting shut down?" But eventually, they do realize that this is not actually their religion anymore. It belongs to the state. And the government uses, and they also begin to build shrines in Taipei, in Seoul, other places in Japan's colonies as well, to encourage not just Japanese, but also the colonized people's adoration of the emperor as well as of the sort of holy Japanese nation state. In the 20s, they began to to require shrine visits. So school children would all go on shrine visits to go see shrines, but not any shrines that typically have been kept open, right, and that therefore exemplify some value or a line of thinking that the government thinks is appropriate. So on emperor's birthdays, National Founding Day, these kind of things, which this commemorates the founding of Japan 2,600 years ago, more or less, by the Emperor Jimmu. These things are celebrated by entire schools. Even Catholic schools had to go do this, which, as you can imagine, can be sometimes problematic. The Taisho period also sees the creation of Meiji Shrine, which, unlike shrines up to this point, is a shrine that was state-funded, but then built with labor of, so it's a state-funded and state-created shrine to welcome the kami of Emperor Meiji, but it was built through local support organizations, kind of like the Boy Scouts that were recruited from all over Japan to come and build this shrine. And if you go to Japan, if you go to Tokyo, it's a very nice, beautiful shrine that it's worth visiting. But anyway, I digress. This is Chosen Shrine, Chosen being the derogatory name, looking back on it now, that Korea as a colony had under Japanese rule. The shrine, as you can imagine, is not there anymore, but it used to look like this. And perhaps the most important shrine is Yasukuni Shrine, who we see here. And the shrine becomes so important to everything in Japan at this point. Like like the manual, I was looking at once a manual for Navy seamen, like a moralities textbook for them. And there's a picture of the Yasukuni Shrine, the gate, and there's a woman who's mourning her son, but he's saying it's okay. You can always come see me at Yasukuni Shrine. So they are being told that they will be, when they fight for Japan, they can count on their spirits being, or their kami being welcomed back at Yasukuni Shrine. And it's there. It's also the most popular shrine in Japan throughout the early Showa period. And it is the shrine that we see the imperial visits to the most often in the pre-war period. In particular, here we see Emperor Showa visiting this important shrine as well. It's even on the money. On the 50 yen note here, we see the old original Yasukuni Shrine. So very pervasive, right? So Shinto has made its way into the popular imagination, and on important days like imperial birthdays or National Founders Day, people did go in large numbers to this shrine. Let's talk a bit about Manchuria, what's happening on the continent. Basically, we have the military of Japan is in Manchuria to protect the South Manchurian Railroad, which they acquired from Russia in 1905 with their victory in the Russo-Japanese War. So they're there for that reason, and also to protect Japanese investments and interests on the continent. Here we can see some major sites that are important, I guess, to know about. But anyway, let's skip that and go to what's happening here. So the army was there for these reasons, right? But as we talked about, the thinking of sort of mid-level officers in the army in particular is very much geared towards expansion and through military activity, right? And so we see that sort of officers in the middle of the ranks are wanting to occupy and officially take over these territories that they are just supposed to be looking after. There was a warlord named Zhuang Zuoyin, who is a warlord in Manchuria. At this point in time, there are lots of warlords throughout China who are controlling things because of a breakdown in the state structure. This particular warlord was willing to be a sort of, was open to Japanese collaboration and helping them to iron out things that need to be ironed out, helping them to get contracts signed for various mining and other kinds of resource extraction things, railroad usage issues, popular dissent. He helped them with all these kinds of things, and he was paid for that, right? But he began to talk with Chinese nationalists who were worried about Japan's ambitions for China. And so he was assassinated. Essentially, the Japanese military blew up a train in which he was traveling and then blamed that explosion on Chinese dissidents or Chinese saboteurs. And this was supposed to, in their view, allow Japan to come and put down these Chinese, rebels, right? But it did not work. But what's interesting is what happens afterwards. So these men, who we now know were influenced heavily by Kitaiki, they launched this attack, but then it didn't work, and the government did not send troops, not authorize the sending of troops to go invade China. But the Showa emperor also debated whether he thought that they should actually be prosecuted or not. And the prime minister at this point was Prime Minister Hamaguchi, if you'll recall from before, right? And he, of course, wanted to prosecute these people because he is for a more, a progressive, more accountable governance. But the emperor essentially tells him not to do that because it would embarrass the military. So, first of all, this is a problem. The emperor has to then say, well, this is not good, you didn't handle this correctly, so you have to resign. So then he resigns. He's also already been injured, so this will help him to sort of leave that job. But then the emperor does not seek justice, and the fact that no one is prosecuted for this is really a big deal. So the Japanese military, for the first time, has led an attack on another country, disobeying orders from the civilian government and from the top brass in the Japanese military, and nothing happens to them. So this is a sign of the beginning of the rise of militarism in Japan. Let's also talk about a figure named Ishiwara Kanji. He is a figure who will be the most important ideas person and a senior figure in the Kwantung Army, the army of the Japanese army in Manchuria. He is a military man, but not very high level. I think he's like a lieutenant, but he will then rise to become a general in this Kwantung army. And he has a very clear idea of how things should happen. So he sort of has the idea of how to execute this expansion through militarism that will liberate Asia. Japan has to control the resources of Manchuria for its own survival, which then in turn will allow Japan to help the rest of Asia. Japan must achieve its own economic self-sufficiency or independence, which again is predicated upon controlling Manchuria. And then he also then orchestrates a way to take over Manchuria and make these things happen. And the protocol will be one of the low overtaking the high, or Gekokujo, which we had maybe seen earlier in the class, if you'll recall, during the Warring States period, as the many people who were fighting and trying to become themselves daimyo or to overthrow those who were above them and upset the social order, socio-economic and political order. So it is Ishiwara Kanji and his Manchurian plan, right, which are behind the Manchurian incident. And this is an incident that happens in September of 31, in which we have more of these pesky Chinese saboteurs who are going to sabotage a Japanese railway this time, the South Manchurian Railway. And they attempt to sabotage it, and there's an explosion. No one dies. Very little actual damage happens, right? But this explosion is blamed on the Chinese, who then, this gives the Japanese Kuomintang army the excuse or justification to then occupy Manchuria, which they do with very little resistance. The government in Tokyo is not aware this is going to happen, and because of precedents, as I just discussed a little bit before, of inaction or of a lack of reaction, there's no pathway for them to check this once it's happened, without admitting that they have essentially the entire contingent of the Kuomintang army has committed insubordination. So they are left in a tight spot. They disapprove and they try and intervene, but they are unable to do so. Within less than a year, the Kuomintang army takes over Manchuria, and they create a puppet state called Manchukuo. They want this to have the appearance of an independent country. Yeah, Kevin.
I was going to say, was this like an easy decision for the Japanese military to make? Because I remember, like we learned about this earlier, it was like kind of almost, you know, and they wanted to, like it was important that you understood Chinese culture. You had to like understand Confucius and stuff like that in some of the schools. So was that like an easy decision for them to make, or did they just see an opportunity?
A good question. I think it was easy because they wanted the resources. The hard part was how do you justify, how do you explain this, right? And one of the ways that they did this was by arguing that they were going to bring, they were going to make this area sort of pacify it. So that the sort of Chinese traditions that were there, as well as the Manchu, which are actually not like actually Chinese in terms of ethnic background, their traditions also could be allowed to flourish here, as well as Japanese, Russian, and Korean peoples could all flourish here. So there was some discourse, right, about, or discussion about like Chinese culture and keeping it. But the real goal here is resources, right? Human resources and other kinds of resources that can be taken away from and used for Japan from this territory. But yeah, very interesting question. And also the issues of racial identity in Japan at this point in time are very interesting. There's a lot of race science going on, showing the Japanese as superior racially to other races in neighboring countries. So that also is why they're justified in taking this role in creating this puppet state. And to make sure it looks legit, they also bring in the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, who had been deposed. There's a movie about this, you've probably seen it. It's a very famous story. And he essentially is allowed to go back to his native homes, right, in Manchuria, where the Qing peoples used to live and be confined to, and then to rule this fake country, which he does. And the government, the Japanese military then oversee the importing and the sort of burgeoning of heavy industry, coal and iron mining and other kinds of, and factories, heavy industry in this area. And the Japanese then now have, in reality, control of all the resources that they could possibly want in this area. Here we have Emperor Puyi when he was deposed, and here we have him when he becomes the emperor of Manchukuo. Japan does this. League of Nations, which you'll recall would not put in a racial equality clause when it was founded, does not think this is fair. They argue that Japan has broken various international rules, has invaded a sovereign country, and that Manchukuo is not a country, it is a colony, and that Japan needs to give it back. So Japan storms out of the League of Nations in March of 33, walking away from the Western, sort of the global, Western-controlled global order,